Well, good evening. Welcome to Climate Conversations with Reverend Lennox Yearwood and Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. We are coming to you tonight from Connecticut, so I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the native land that we are on. We acknowledge that Connecticut, Algonquin, land of the tidal river, is the traditional home of the Mohegans, Pequots, and many other tribes. We are grateful for our native people's care for their home and will strive to preserve it for the next 7 generations. I am so excited to welcome our 2 guest speakers and our moderator. These folks are just giants in the world of climate justice, and you are really going to enjoy tonight. My name is Terry Eichel. I am with the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, a faith-based environmental nonprofit that works with religious communities to inspire them to be good stewards of the earth. We are a Connecticut-based organization, and we are also proud to be the Connecticut affiliate for Interfaith Power and Light, a national organization that organizes the religious community to respond to global warming. This webinar is the first in a series called Many Faiths, One Creation, and it's a collaboration with the Hartford Seminary. We are delighted to be working with them. And this will be the first of what I hope will be many offerings. Our next joint webinar is on Thursday, April 8th, and is entitled Religious Communities and the Planetary Crisis. I will definitely send you out information to register after this webinar. So we are really pleased to bring these 2 powerful advocates to you this evening. I hope that at the end of the evening, you are inspired to take action to push for fair and just climate policy, both in your towns, in your states, and on the national level. I would like now to hand the reins to the president of Hartford Seminary, Joel Lohr.
Thank you so much, Terry. It is my honor to be here with you as the president of Hartford Seminary, and we're delighted to be hosting this event with you, the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, on this very important topic. And just as you did, we would also like to acknowledge the native peoples of this land, pay respect to the peoples of the Pequannock, Wagunks, Sikyag, and Tunxis, the traditional custodians of the land where the city of Hartford is situated. If you're not familiar with Hartford Seminary, let me just say a few things. We are a graduate school with a focus on interfaith dialogue and peace building, and we have a diverse and multi-faith faculty and student body. If you are interested in being in community with people who might not otherwise meet, which is a proven way to break down barriers, we are the place to do it. Take a look at our website, hartsem.edu, for information about our programs and events, all of which are online at the moment, as you can imagine. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to you, Terry, for this wonderful event, introducing me as well, for all of your hard work in organizing it, the first in this collaborative series. I'd also like to thank the co-founders of the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, Reverend Tom Carr and Lynn Fulkerson, both who have been incredibly dedicated to saving our planet and have been highly involved in planning these events. I need to also add that Lynn has also been a longtime and generous donor to Hartford Seminary in our International Peace Building Program. And so thank you, Lynn, for your leadership and for your support. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this evening. Rabbi Joshua Hammerman is a celebrated rabbi and award-winning journalist, author, and blogger who has served Temple Beth El in Stamford, Connecticut for over 3 decades. His most recent book, Embracing Auschwitz, Forging a Vibrant, Life-Affirming Judaism that Takes the Holocaust Seriously, has been hailed as by far the most original book on the Holocaust that has come along in many years. He has written and contributed to a number of other books as well. And I need to mention that I have in my possession, Menschmarks, a really great book. If you haven't read it, you should get that as well. And actually, I should add, right before this, I went and ordered Embracing Auschwitz. It's a really good price right now on Amazon. Not that I'm plugging his book for this event, but it's a great book as well. I'm assuming if I know anything about his Menschmark. So I just went and bought it myself. During these turbulent months of 2020, Joshua's regular dispatches from the rabbi's bunker and in this moment have provided comfort and inspiration to his congregants and to so many others around the world. And so, welcome, Josh.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm so delighted and to see such a large group and to see a diverse group and a group that combines, synthesizes what so needs to be integrated these days, the world of science and faith. And I think we'll see that coming into play with our amazing guests this evening. By the way, what you're looking at behind me is the roof of my synagogue. That's what brought me and Terry together, as we have one of the largest solar fields on a roof or anywhere on a religious institution in this state. And so I'm actually not standing on the roof right now, so don't worry. But I wanted people to see just an example of how the worlds of faith and science can come together. This is a very exciting time for those concerned about our planet, but a very perilous time as well. So we're going to hear from both of our speakers. First, they will each make a presentation. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. And I encourage you to put your questions into the chat and to share them, and we'll try to select from them as we go along in the program. Let's start with Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who is an endowed professor in public policy and public law in the Public Administration Program, Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University, and co-directs the Climate Center at Texas Tech. Her research focuses on developing and applying high-resolution climate projections to evaluate the future impacts of climate change on human society and the natural environment. She's published over 125 peer-reviewed abstracts and publications and served as lead author on key reports for the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the National Academy of Sciences. Her TED Talk has been viewed nearly 3 million times. Why can't you get it over 3 million? Really, nearly 3 million? She's currently writing a book on talking about climate change that will be released early in 2021. She's an Oxfam Sister of the Planet, currently chairs the Earth Science Women's Network Advisory Council, as well as serving on the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communications Prize Committee. She's on lots of boards and think tanks, advisory board of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum as well. In 2019, Dr. Hayhoe was named to Foreign Policy's list of 100 global thinkers for the second time and received the United Nations Environment Programme's flagship award, being named Champion of the Earth in the category of Science and Innovation. And so I present Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be with you. I do realize I have to update the bio though, because the TED Talk is well past 3, pushing 4. So I will get on that after we're done. It is great to be with all of you here on Zoom and on Facebook listening live. And I'm so delighted to be able to speak with Reverend Yearwood, because we have similar approaches in terms of that we take a faith-based approach to the issues that we care about, but we come at it from such different angles that I love that we're able to finally get together and do this together. So I'm going to be starting off by talking about where we've been the last few years, where we are now, and what we need to move forward. So to do that, let me share my screen. As of January this year, the last 4 years of the Trump administration had seen 112 rollbacks of regulation related to clean air, clean water, pollution, and climate. You can see the list here on the right-hand side. Basic things that you wouldn't even imagine could possibly be politicized, like toxic substances, somehow have become some of the most politicized issues in the country. In fact, this past year, polling by the Pew Foundation found that climate change was the #1 most politically polarized issue in the country, and environmental protection was #2. That was in February. Then COVID hit. And as of August, the #3 most politicized issue was COVID. #2 was racial equity and justice. And #3 was still climate change. We learned that the Trump administration had buried clean energy studies, even though clean energy is obviously the energy of the future. I worked as a lead author on the US National Climate Assessment for 3 years during the administration. And I reported personally, on the left here you have my Twitter thread, on the right you have an article I wrote about this. I reported personally on all the different ways that the administration had interfered with and misrepresented the very fundamental basic science that was being presented in this report. Don't worry, I'll put a link to that essay in the chat if anybody wants to find it. So a couple of weeks ago, when a new administration came in, for many people, it felt a little bit like this, the dawn of a new day. And immediately, President Biden went to work signing executive orders. Like what? Well, here's a partial list. So first of all, on Climate Day, so to speak, which was a couple of weeks ago, he created a White House Office of Domestic Policy and a National Climate Task Force to coordinate federal efforts, because it's not just an EPA issue. Climate change affects almost every agency. I myself have worked with the Department of Transportation, Department of Interior, Department of Defense. All of this relates to climate change. He also established councils to address racial equity and environmental justice. He founded an initiative that's going to send 40% of the benefits from federal investments to disadvantaged communities. A study by the International Monetary Fund 2 years ago found that fossil fuel subsidies, fossil fuels companies are, of course, among the richest corporations in the world. Fossil fuel subsidies in the United States exceeded the Pentagon's budget. So what the new president also announced was that they would be eliminating federal fossil fuel subsidies starting in 2022. They would suspend new oil and gas leases on federal land, plan to conserve 30% of federal lands and water, create a civilian climate corps for conservation, and look at the issue of a just transition. Communities whose economy is built on fossil fuels, like, for example, coal mining areas in West Virginia, Southern Ohio, Kentucky, establish a working group dedicated to revitalizing their communities. And that's not all. In addition, the Pentagon had declared a while ago, actually 4 or 5 years ago, they had first declared that climate change was a national security issue, but the Biden administration allowed them to put climate change at the center of national security and foreign policy, to designate climate change as a national security threat, and icing on the cake, they also plan to make government vehicles all electric. So all of this has happened over just the past few weeks. And when I say happened, I just mean that the intent has been announced. Obviously, it takes quite a while to put a lot of this into practice. Some of the goals aren't for another 10 years. But let's just take a step back here, because I want to point out something that you might not be aware of. Where do carbon emissions come from in the United States? And of course, carbon emissions are the #1 reason why climate is changing. Through digging up and burning coal and natural gas and oil, we are producing heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it does not need. That is why the planet is running a fever. So where do carbon emissions come from in the United States? Now, sometimes you see a figure showing that where they come from in terms of by sector. They come from electricity or transportation or buildings. Sometimes you see it by different gases, because there's also methane, nitrous oxide, other gases. You might see it by state. But what I'm going to show you is it's an approximation. I'm not sure of all the data, but I collected what I could. And this is the approximation to give you an idea. About 30 to maybe at the most 40% of carbon emissions are controlled by the individual choices that people make. About 10% of carbon emissions result directly from the military. The Department of Defense is responsible for 10% of national emissions. The rest of the government is responsible for a tiny, tiny little sliver. And then the lion's share is produced by industry and the private sector. So this figure shows why we cannot solve this problem by small individual actions like changing light bulbs. We cannot solve this problem by big individual actions like everybody driving a plug-in car, or even the whole government driving a plug-in car. And we cannot solve climate change merely by voting in a new president. All of these are positive actions in the right direction, but none of them are sufficient in and of themselves. Why? Because what's needed to fix climate change is you. Literally everyone. We are all part of climate solutions. Every single one of us as individuals, as families and households, as congregations, places of work, or worship, schools, universities, tribal nations, cities, counties, states. All of us individually and collectively must be part of the solution in order to succeed. And here's the good news. Over the last 4 years, this was already happening. The We Are Still In movement was born when President Trump announced that he would be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement 4 years ago. As of this past year, they had almost 4,000 members representing 159 million people across 50 states, totaling almost $10 trillion worth of GDP and just under half of US carbon emissions. Who is still in on the Paris Agreement and has been over the last 4 years? Well, companies like Apple, Walmart, and Microsoft. In fact, Microsoft announced last year that they plan to be not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative by 2030. Who else is still in on the Paris Agreement? Well, we know that there are solutions to climate change all across the spectrum. If you are not familiar with Project Drawdown, I recommend that you check it out. In fact, if somebody wants to put the link in the chat there, the website is just drawdown.org. They describe over 100 different solutions to climate change, some of them very high tech, like distributed energy storage, and some of them very low tech, like coastal wetland protection or carpooling. So I serve on the scientific advisory board of a company that you might not have heard of. It's called Engie. It's a French company, and it's an energy company. Not an energy company in terms of oil and gas, but an energy company in terms of providing electricity and heating and things like that. They're a multinational corporation, and they plan to be the first carbon neutral energy company in the world. So last year, before COVID hit, I was at our last scientific board meeting. And just out of curiosity, I asked their chief scientific officer, I said, "Are you familiar with Project Drawdown?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I am." And I said, "Well, I noticed that you are even doing some agricultural projects here at Engie. How have you considered looking at any of these Project Drawdown solutions?" And he said, "Oh, yes." He said, "I went through their list just a few weeks ago. And as a matter of fact, I think we're already implementing 84 of them. 84 out of 100. So who's still in? All kinds of companies. What about cities? Well, something called the C40 Cities has 97 major cities around the world, including a number in the United States, as you can see from the colored dots right here. Together, those cities represent 1 out of every 12 people around the world. They represent 25% of the global gross domestic product. And they are still in on the Paris Agreement and are cutting their carbon emissions too. The latest to join them is the city of Houston, which is the home of the oil and gas industry here in the United States. Houston just announced their new targets last August. Who else is acting? Well, a lot of people have investment funds. You probably have some retirement funds invested. Big organizations have retirement funds invested. And there's a movement called divestment where people take their money, whether it's individual people or organizations or churches or businesses, they remove their money from fossil fuel investments. Last year, BlackRock, which is an investment company which controls over $7 trillion worth of investments, announced that they would be divesting from coal. Not enough yet, but it's a good start. And if you look around the world, here's the interesting thing. What type of organizations represent the #1 category who've divested from fossil fuels? Faith-based organizations. Why? Because they know it's the right thing to do. But you've got educational institutions, philanthropers, governments, pension funds, for-profit corporations, NGOs, healthcare institutions, and more. Who else is taking action? Well, you won't be surprised after the last figure to know that churches are acting. The World Evangelical Alliance has announced that they're planning to convert 1 out of every 5 facilities to solar energy. Interfaith Power and Light, which of course Hartford Seminary is a local chapter of, Interfaith Power and Light has something called the Paris Pledge, where congregations, and you can see a partial list of them here below, congregations can sign up to take the Paris Pledge and cut their carbon emissions. Climate Caretakers is a Christian organization where individual people can sign up. And every month you get a list of 3 things that you can do about climate change. Then there's organizations like We Renew, which provides a way for neighborhoods and households to sign up. They actually develop customized websites for universities like Arizona State University, for churches like the U.S. Episcopal Church, for different cities and states, so that households can sign up and they can find neighbors who might be taking action, and they can go visit with them and say, hey, I noticed that you got solar panels. How much did it cost? How much did it cut your power bill? Did you find an installer that you liked? So there are people everywhere who are already taking action. And that's why when I did a TED Talk, and this is not my TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, this is where you should go watch it. This is when I did a TED Talk, I said, the most important thing that any individual person can do about climate change, it is not our individual personal actions to cut our carbon footprint, although those are certainly important, and I do those too. It is using our voices to advocate for change at every level. That is how we as individuals can and must make a difference. Now, of course, this past year, we have been overtaken by the tidal wave of COVID. And right behind it, we have the economic recession. And behind that, we have the tsunami of climate change. Even within this, though, there lies opportunity. Let me give you just a few examples. Example number 1, when everything shut down this spring, children couldn't go to school, industry couldn't shut down, people weren't traveling, we cut our carbon emissions so much, so fast, that if the changes that we saw in spring, if the cuts in our carbon emissions that we saw in spring had been permanent, we would be almost halfway to our global Paris goal for 2030 in just a few weeks. Let me say that again. We would be almost halfway to our 2030 goal in just a few weeks if those changes had been permanent. Now, of course, they weren't permanent because they weren't sustainable. What are sustainable changes? Efficiency, clean energy, reducing our carbon emissions in ways that grow jobs and grow the economy rather than reducing it. But the good news is this showed us that when we act, we can make a difference. What else have we seen? We've seen that many cities, states, and even countries are taking the opportunity of the economic recovery to invest in green recovery and sustainable plans. We know that last year during the pandemic, according to the International Energy Agency, 90%, that's right, 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean, renewable energy. 90%. That's amazing. Countries like Canada are saying if you want COVID relief, you're going to have to disclose your climate impacts. We are seeing positive steps even through COVID on climate. So as Greta Thunberg says, in fact, this is the title of her book, no one is too small to make a difference. And if a young girl from a relatively small country can, by raising her voice, make a difference like she has, how can we not make a difference? I want to close with one story, and it's the story of a man called Glenn. Oops, before I get to Glenn, let me just point this out. I'm sorry. We often think, okay, well, if I'm going to use my voice, the number one thing I should do is go talk to my congressperson or my senator, right? And it's really hard to get your foot in the door. But did you know that in the United States, there are 519,000 elected officials, and 96% of them are at their local level, 3.6% at the state level, and only 0.1% at the federal level? So when you go to talk to people, consider talking to a school board member, a county officer, a city council person, a mayor, a township member. There are people that you can talk to very easily without having to wait your turn or send a letter that never gets responded to. And I want to actually illustrate exactly this point with the story of Glenn. Here is Glenn right here, and me. So my TED Talk came out in December. And in May, this is 2 years ago, in the following May, I was giving a talk near where Glenn lived in the UK. And so after my talk, he approached me. He said he'd taken the train in to listen because he had watched my TED Talk in December. And ever since then, he had realized that he needed to be having conversations about climate change in his town of Wandsworth. So he said, I've actually kept a list of how many conversations I've had. Would you like to see the list? I said, sure, I would love to. So he reached in his bag and he pulled out a list of over 10,000 names of people who had had conversations about climate change in his town of Wandsworth. And today he was sending me an update. He was saying, not only has the council voted to declare a climate emergency, they're investing 20 million pounds, which for a small town is a lot of money, on their environment and sustainability strategy. They have all kinds of community discussions going on. They have plans to tackle climate change. The entire city has gone from doing absolutely nothing to being on absolute fire for climate action. Why? Because one man decided to have a conversation. So even though we may feel like there's a new day dawning, even though we may feel like the president has this thing under control, my message to you is every single one of us matters. Everyone is needed to make a difference. And the most important thing that you can do is to use your voice to advocate for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, what a wonderful way to start this program. So I'm going to now introduce our second panelist, the Reverend Lennox Yearwood. Reverend Yearwood Jr. is the president and founder of Hip Hop Caucus, a minister, community activist, U.S. Air Force veteran, and one of the most influential people in hip hop political life. He founded Hip Hop Caucus in September of 2004. The goal of Hip Hop Caucus is to build a powerful and sustainable organization for the culture's role in the civic process and empowerment of communities impacted first and worst by injustice. As a national leader and pacemaker within the Green Movement, Reverend Yearwood has been successfully bridging the gap between communities of color and environmental issue advocacy. With a diverse set of celebrity allies, he has raised awareness and action in communities that are often overlooked by traditional environmental campaigns and elected officials. His innovative stance has garnered the Hip Hop Caucus support from several environmental leaders, including the Sunrise Movement, League of Conservation Voters, Earth Justice, and Zero Hour. So, Reverend Yearwood, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here at the Hartford Seminary and with my new friend and ally, Dr. Hayhoe. I will be speaking to you. I literally had to have a surgery today, and so I will be trying to do a number of these surgery on my eye, of all things, and so I will be doing this conversation with you as much by memory as much by knowing what I hope will connect with you. First, let me just say this again, that I got involved with this movement simply because I'm originally from Louisiana. And being from Louisiana now 15 years ago, I witnessed Hurricane Katrina and witnessed not only poor people, but people of color drowning in the richest country in the world. And so that still gives me nightmares, and that is what propels me to do this work, because this work wasn't driven by what's going to happen in the future. I've literally seen it devastate and destroy communities throughout this country. So with that, I wanted to have this conversation and really speak about transportation justice. Today actually is Transit Equity Day, and it is also Rosa Parks' 108th birthday. And so today, to honor the woman who kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott, we have been spreading the word at the Hip Hop Caucus on transit equity to protect the essential role that accessible public transit plays in creating healthy, equal, and prosperous communities. What we know is that Black and brown communities are both disproportionately crippled by climate change and disproportionately reliant on public transportation. So to ensure that all communities have safe, affordable, and easy accessible trains, buses, and subways, we understand this is an essential act of justice. So it's been 65 years since Rosa Parks made her brave stand. And so we have been calling upon Congress to legislate for a better public transportation for climate justice and for racial justice. But before I get into that, I guess it's important to kind of show why Rosa Parks got into this movement in the first place. Because one of the things, and Dr. Hayhoe mentioned this in her speech, was about the divestment movement and also a number of other movements that I have now been blessed to be a part of. Last year, myself and Bill McKibben were working, and we were arrested, fighting to stop the money from the fossil fuel industry. In essence, if we could stop the banks and a number of the entities who were funding the fossil fuel industry, then we could stop climate change itself. And so we found ourselves in the Hooskow behind that action. But since then, we've created a campaign called StopTheMoneyPipeline.com. It was on the heels of the divestment campaign that we were a part of. So I was so happy to hear Dr. Hayhoe mention that as well, because that was literally many years ago when we began to push forward. And since that time, trillions of dollars have been divested from the fossil fuel industry. But what makes that more remarkable is this. It's the standpoint that we now have a moment where we're now seeing what we've done in the streets beginning to have effect in the suites. What I mean by that is that one of the other acts that I was arrested for, I don't want you Harvard Seminary students, if you're watching, to think this is the only way you can get change here. You just saw a great presentation that you can get it through legislation and obviously doing some amazing things. But in the case of some of the things that we have done, there have been times where we've had to put our bodies on the line fighting for justice. And so we fought to stop the Keystone XL pipeline and were arrested many times for that, as we were stopping the Dakota Access Pipeline and also the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We were successful on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and we were successful this year to have, on the first day, President Biden declared null and void the Keystone XL pipeline. Why this is important, before I get into interpretation justice, is because it shows that faith has a huge role to play and how we can make a difference in changing done deals. Faith has a huge role to play when things have been sealed, when folks are saying that the environment or the crisis is too much. Faith has a role to play in which we can put our bodies against the gears of the machine and bring it to a grinding halt. That is the power of what we're seeing right now. And that is why Rosa Parks' story is so important on this day, because when Rosa Parks sat down on that bus in December 1st of 1955, we know now that what propelled her to make sure she would take on anything was because what she had seen on August 28th of 1955, the killing of Emmett Till. It was the killing of Emmett Till that would help Rosa Parks to stay seated on the front of that bus, to stand up to white supremacy, to stand up to white privilege, to stand up to Jim Crow, and to make sure that to this day we would benefit from that. It was that moment, though, from Emmett Till, and we have seen that for us today, as we are now connecting the dots between racial justice and climate justice and environmental justice. What we saw last year, not only through COVID, but also what we saw with the situation with Breonna Taylor and the killing of George Floyd, what we saw there changed our movement entirely. We even know that President Biden said he decided to come and run for office after what he saw in Charlottesville and the killing of Heather Heyer, where I was in Charlottesville on that day when Nazis and those marched with tiki torches to take us back to a time. So that's the connection. And if we do nothing today, we must understand that we must break down the silos within our climate movement. If we do not do that, we will not be successful. And that's where we come in today and why transportation justice is so important. And for those who don't know what transportation justice is the equal access of all people to the transportation they need for a better quality of life. And how we move matters, but not all our communities have the same access to healthy and safe transportation options. What we're seeing is that public transportation and public transit in BIPOC communities is often unaffordable, inaccessible, and inconvenient. And for those that don't travel by a car, a trip to the grocery store may require an hour walk or an unsafe sidewalk in an unsafe neighborhood. Work commutes can be up to 2 hours longer by transit than they are by car. Improvements in transportation infrastructure must be prioritized for the people that need them most. It's time that we demand transportation justice. And transportation justice means accessibility, better and more abundant transportation options, and increased affordability that give members greater access to goods, jobs, housing, and services, and increase public health and safety. We know that transportation justice is climate justice, and pollution, along with other particulate matter, are one of the key concerns in regards to transportation justice. Transportation justice begins by transforming streets and public spaces into a safe space where all of citizens can be and enjoy. Let me conclude with this in this process. What we know right now is that the connection with environmental justice is that many companies and enterprises put their pollution, their landfill, and their disease and destruction directly in communities of color. And it is those communities of color today who have been standing up and saying that this must change. And so what we now have is a moment where the climate movement must now connect the dots and understand that transportation justice, mobility justice, climate justice is all connected to climate change. If it is not connected, then we will fail. And that's our call tonight, to make sure we stand up and profess the need for transportation justice. Thank you so much. I hope what I said was well, and I hope it was good, and we will move on with the process. Thank you.
Great. Wow. I mean, from both of you, I really feel enlightened already. But we have some great questions in the chat already, and I will get to those. I just want to start though by fleshing out a little of what you said, Reverend, just a minute ago, in talking about toxic dumping, especially coal ash, pipeline construction, residue, right, all the things that are affecting communities, impoverished communities, communities with less representation, perhaps. Do you see a direct connection with the current administration to this issue? Do you think that they'll be taking it on?
I do think, thank you for that because we know that 68% of people of color, particularly Black people, live within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants and was getting asthma and emphysema and cancer. And so what we're seeing now with one of the executive orders, as you know, President Biden's executive orders had both an international, which was very important, but also a domestic. And they also had the hirings to follow it up, particularly with the Honorable John Kerry from the international standpoint, but also on the domestic side, the phenomenal Gina McCarthy and Alex Zadie, her deputy director. There's clearly within those executive orders, there was a whole section in regards to making environmental justice throughout the entire federal government. So there is and also looking at it not only from the Environmental Protection Agency, which unfortunately was more the Environmental Pollutants Agency in the last administration, but looking at it from the standpoint of an enforcement division, not only there at EPA, but also in the Department of Justice and in Health and Housing Services, and possibly in HUD as well. And so what we're seeing that we will start to see more enforcement of these folks who are perpetrating these crimes. And let me say, this is a crime. One of the hardest things I had to do, putting on my ministerial hat, one of the hardest things I had to do was, as you know, I work within many communities of color within really hard, I mean, sometimes they're dealing with the pollution, they're dealing with the pandemic, they're dealing with poverty. And so for me, dealing with police brutality, I'm working we work in Hip Hop Caucus, working right with these communities. One of the hardest things for me to do was a situation where having to do a funeral for a little girl whose mother had to choose between either could she afford the inhaler because her daughter had asthma, or could she buy groceries for her other children? And she was playing Russian roulette, literally, and not understanding how particulate matter works, or how smog or pollutants work. Just seeing that it looks like a good day, but unfortunately, not knowing that she lived right next to a coal-fired power plant, or not too far from. And so when she came home, her daughter was dead. And the entire time I was doing that funeral, the mother was trying to climb into the casket, wishing it was her. That should not be what we have in this country. We should have people choosing literally between groceries and inhalers, and we should have a situation when we can move forward to to clean energy, away from these dirty fossil fuels, putting particularly Black and brown indigenous communities in a position, particularly during COVID, where they are literally dying on the living room floor, and the mother's coming home now, climbing into caskets. That is what we have to change. So you're right. I think that this administration understands that. I've talked to President Biden on several occasions in which he has talked about his own experience in Delaware in regards to pollutants and those kind of things where he lived. And so I think that he gets it. We know that Vice President Harris, before she actually was running, she put forth legislation that was as far as a clearinghouse, which we know that in Congress, Congressman McKeechin and Congressman Grijalva have kind of continued to mantle. We're now still seeing that now with Senator Markey and Congressman Cori Bush, and which I'm so proud, because I remember from the Markey-Waxman bill 10 years ago, which wasn't the greatest bill in some cases because it missed the idea of how important environmental justice was. But now fast forward to where he is now with the Green New Deal, and also now where he is now understanding environmental justice moving forward. So we're growing, even not with the administration in our own movement, but we must still continue to grow faster and understand that we must break down the silos in our movement and hold up environmental justice as a key component, as a key part of our push to solve the climate crisis.
So I want to bring us to issues of how we deal with difficult audiences, challenging audiences in communication. So this is for both of you, but first Peg asked Reverend Yearwood, can you give us ideas about how to speak this to a dominant white community? How would you suggest we talk with our communities about environmental justice and how everything is connected to climate justice? And to Katharine, I want to sort of maybe go to you first. And I know that you have deep connections with the evangelical community. And what is your strategy? I suppose we should never generalize, of course. And you showed the statistics that this is a popular topic among people of faith. But there is the sense that those who are more resistant to science, who think, for instance, that I know how to make space lasers, that they would be hard to communicate this science-based issue to. So let's start with you. How do you do that?
Well, first of all, that's exactly the topic of my TED Talk. And I put my TED Talk there in the chat, so I would encourage everybody to give it a look. But in a nutshell, people are people. And whoever we are, we're all human. And that means that there is a simple 3-step process to having a constructive conversation. Step number 1, begin with something that we have in common, that we share, that we agree on, rather than something we disagree on. So that something we share could be a shared faith. It could be the fact that we're both parents. We live in the same place. We enjoy doing the same things. We both have military experience. We both own a small business. We both work as educators or in the medical field. Start with something we have in common is the first step. The second step is to connect the dots between what we already care about and how climate change affects it. Because the only reason we care about climate change is because it already affects everything that we already care about today. And then step number 3, very important, do not stop without bringing in positive, constructive solutions that are already happening, solutions that you might be doing in your personal life, solutions that your church or congregation or city might be doing, solutions you might have read about that a company or an organization or a state is doing. Because if we just tell people there's a problem, but we don't understand that we can do things to fix it, then we're not going to support climate action. So this approach works with everybody except the 7% of people in the US who are dismissive. 7%. Dismissive people will dismiss anything and everything. Dismissive people would dismiss an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame. So who are we to try to convince a dismissive person? They are the uncle at Thanksgiving who always brings up climate change like a sore tooth. The colleague who spends their lunch hour commenting on online articles about climate change. We often think that we have to talk to the loudest voices, but those loudest voices are just 7%. Those voices are the immovables. The 93%, those are the people that we can have constructive, positive conversations with.
So you would ignore the 7%?
I do, unless it's in a public setting. If it's in a public setting, I simply say, no, that's not true. And if they've said something like it's just a natural cycle or it's the sun, I use one of my global weirding videos, which I'll put the link here in the chat, to say, we know that according to natural cycles, we should be cooling. I just leave it right at that one sentence. And then I immediately flip and I say, did you know there's more jobs in the solar energy industry than there is in the entire coal industry? How do you feel about that? So I turn it right around, but I do not play the whack-a-mole game with dismissives because you will waste your time, you will never change their mind, and you could be talking to 93% of everybody else, really making a difference.
Do you have a go-to, let's say, Bible story or theological message that can open doors that might not otherwise open?
I do have a number of global weirding episodes specifically on things like what does the Bible say about climate change? But I would say for most people, just going to what we believe is absolutely essential. And you know, just as well as I do, in the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about how people have responsibility over every living thing on this planet, how people are to take care of and to protect the garden that God gave us, which is this planet. And then there's so much about caring for those who are less fortunate than us, about caring for the poor and the widows and those who are disadvantaged. So it's all throughout everything that we believe that this is who we are. This is who we are intended to be. It's not somehow foreign to our principles and our beliefs. In fact, it's entirely consistent with them. And if we take the Bible seriously, we'd actually be out at the front of the lines demanding climate action, just like the Rev and Bill McKibben and others. We wouldn't be dragging our feet at the back.
Right. It starts with the custodianship of the Garden of Eden. in fact. So Rev, what do you think in terms of the question that Peg had? What are the strategies of talking to a, largely white audience, an audience that may not have as deep a commitment and a passion that you might have toward these social justice issues?
Well, I think there's a number of things to that. I think, well, first, let me just say that we have to recognize that our modern day climate movement has a culture. A lot of times the climate movement says it wants culture, it wants to accept culture. And I think that it has to realize that it has its own culture. The modern day, just so folks can just know where I'm starting from, the modern day climate movement starts along with the creation of EPA. Most of the organizations today were really started between 1968 and 1972. Obviously, the conservation movement, those groups like Sierra Club, NWF, and many others went before that, and there's a different conversation in regards to the conservation movement. But the modern day about the movement, groups like Earth Justice and LCV and Rainforest Action Network, and many others were started between that time frame. When they were created, there was a number of things that were going on in that time frame. There was a powerful gay rights movement. Obviously, there was a powerful women's rights movement, the powerful anti-Vietnam movement, and obviously there was a Black Power movement that was happening, particularly post the assassination of Dr. King. All the movements were kind of happening, and then the environmental movement began to take shape. And one of the things that the environmental movement somewhat did was that it began to break off a little bit. In other words, it had the benefit of being able to self-fund itself, and so it really didn't need to rely as much. And so it was able to then break off and kind of do its own thing and create a dialogue and a culture that it continued literally for the next 40 years until, I mentioned earlier, the Marquis Waxman was pretty much the end of that. When that came about, that was a change, and new groups began to emerge. I think a new movement began to emerge. 350 began to emerge. You have these new groups now like Sunrise and Zero Hour. You have powerful new speakers like Dr. Hayhoe and others who were connecting the dots between science and faith. And so, a new movement began to emerge over the past 10 years and before that. But one of the things that it was a culture, it was really I like to say like a Birkenstock culture that had already been kind of cemented. I like Birkenstocks when everybody say, but I'm just trying to say it was a Birkenstock moment that was there. Why this is important is that still exists today. And so when we first got involved, Hip Hop Caucus, as I mentioned before, I came in really through Katrina. And when I came in, I was immediately told that, oh, you should be working in environmental justice. And that was actually one of the things, because obviously I guess you're Black and you should be working, that should be where your area should be. And I'm like, well, no, I don't want to work in that. And the benefit for me that when I met Bill McKibben, we became very dear friends, and many others, but we became very, very close, very dear friends. And so we weren't, we refused to be putting ourselves in silos and buckets. And so one of the first things I think that has to happen for us to work within our own movement is that we have to break down our biases that we have within our movement, how we think this is supposed to be, how this looks, how this sounds. And I just will be very frank. As the movement is constructed now, we are not strong enough to beat the fossil fuel industry. We have to broaden the movement. We're going to have, it's a movement which we need, all of us as humans. We're going to need Black, white, brown, red, male, female, straight, gay, theist, atheist, humans to come together to be unified. If we do not do that, if we don't have Buddhists and Jews and Christians and Muslims and all of us working together, we're not going to be successful if we in this movement. And so we are going to have to figure out a way to transition. So one of the hardest things I think that had to happen is that the climate movement loves to people that they have to transition. They themselves do not like to transition what they need to do internally. And that's one of the key things I think to your question is that what needs to happen is that the climate movement itself has to internally transition and begin to look at how it can begin to change It's leadership structure. I put out a tweet the other day. I said we need a new climate movement to meet a new climate moment. We're going to need more people of color and indigenous leaders within the movement. We're going to need to have more women who are leading organizations. We right now have a patriarchal climate movement, and so we had to fix these things. And so that's one of the key things off the bat. Our movement has to internally look at that. Then secondly, as we look to culture, we have to be okay with things that don't come from that Birkenstock mentality. At Hip Hop Caucus, we've been doing a number of things called Think 100%. I would love for folk to go there. It's called think100climate.com. I can't, my eyes are blind. I can't put it into the chat. Hope somebody could do that for me. But if you can go there and check that out. But one of the things we do there at Think 1%, that we're creating documentaries and music and art and podcasts that speak to completely different audiences. As a matter of fact, one of the things we've been doing, we actually created a comedy special in which we looked at how we can use comedy with comedians going into a place where it has the highest sea level rise in Norfolk, Virginia, to talk about this, which is right in line with James Cone, one of our most powerful theologians. And when James Cone said about anger and humor are like the left and the right arm, they complement each other. Anger empowers the poor to declare their uncompromising opposition to oppression, and humor prevents them from being consumed by their fury. We need both of that. And so I think that's the one thing. I just want to say, and love is one thing for me. I agree with Dr. Hayhoe. It's hard to talk to those folks who don't get it, but I still know that we have to use love. And I think I still believe love conquers all. And that is the one thing that I believe that will help us to break down all types of barriers and things that keep us from talking to one another.
Terry.
Sure. Yeah. So we have lots of questions. And so Victor asks, do you think carbon pricing will be politically feasible in the US, either federally or at the state level? And where it is not, do you think flexible regulations will be as or nearly as effective in reducing carbon emissions?
Could be for either of you, I guess.
I think it's for either one.
I think you should probably delegate a responder. I'll go ahead and go first. As a scientist, I know that we have to cut carbon emissions as soon as possible, and the climate doesn't care how we do it. But as a human, I know that it makes sense to have bipartisan solutions, and I'm encouraged by the fact that there is a bipartisan climate solutions caucus in the Congress and in the Senate. There's something called the Climate Leadership Council, and I'll put a link to that in the chat here too, that has a lot of big businesses who are part of it, who support a price on carbon. And as you may know, I'm Canadian, and we have a price on carbon in Canada. It is a federal price across the whole country, but in fact, the 4 provinces of Canada has states, or provinces, not states, the 4 provinces in Canada that had a price on carbon before it became a federal policy, they actually led the country in economic output over that time. So there is significant evidence around the world that carbon pricing really does work. And there is relatively significant bipartisan support here in the United States, to the point where if Republicans could get past seeing climate change as a dirty or swear word almost, if they could get to the point where they say, okay, it's real, we got to fix it, I feel like at that point, carbon pricing might be one of the first things people might turn to.
Great. Rev?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, because I think that, obviously there are tremendous benefits behind carbon pricing, but there are also a lot of, again, as we've been talking about environmental justice, there are some issues with it as well, in which when you allow for polluters and to pollute more, and where does that pollution go, and will it impact vulnerable communities? And I think that was how 10 years ago, well, now 12 years ago now, the Markey Waxman bill didn't work, but we've seen successes. We've definitely seen it. Obviously, we heard it in Canada. We've definitely seen it in Washington State when they had this PACT legislation, and how they were able to use the money from the tax to then go back into vulnerable communities and looking at it from that aspect. So I think there's I think a lot of folks now in Congress, we have some amazing environmental justice advocates who understand what's at stake here. And so I'm not sure where it will go, but I definitely know it would be front and center in the conversation moving forward.
Thank you. And Joel from Hartford Seminary would like to ask a question.
Thank you for letting me jump in. I am so inspired by this conversation. I'm so honored to be part of it and for this to be happening here. First of all, to Reverend Yearwood, I have no idea how you are still here having had surgery today, but thank you for that. Amazing. And Dr. Hayhoe, I didn't realize we are fellow Canadians, and it's nice to hear you speak and inspire me again. That's actually my question. I have been actively, in my own ways, trying to be supportive of eco-justice work. I remember I lived in California for 6 years. I remember the water drought, and then just being discouraged by the fact that no matter how hard we tried as domestic water users, we were only 10% of total water use in the state, and 90% was agricultural, industrial. For years, and as a lymphoma survivor, I know very well that lymphoma is linked very closely to Roundup and other toxins in our food, and just getting so depressed by the government changing the allowable levels of Roundup and other toxins in our food. And at some point, you just get so discouraged by it all, and it almost takes more energy out of you than the stress of it and worrying about what you're eating, and you just kind of like, the white flag. And is this really worth my time and energy at times? I'm getting re-inspired by you. There's times, even investing in the market, how do you do this? And it's such a big problem, and it feels overwhelming. You're inspiring me to realize that I can do more, and that person in the UK with bringing his town, but how do you stay positive about it all? It must be hard at times. Maybe it's a question first for Dr. Hayhoe. At least I see your energy. Boy, you are full of energy and getting me back into this, but help me.
Well, where we find hope is really the question I think we all have these days. And that's, I think, why people are so desperate to get that hope from politics. And certainly it is hopeful to see positive motion at the federal level in the United States and in Canada. But that's not the only place where change is happening. And so I actually make a practice of hope in terms of going out and looking for stories of individual people or companies or unexpected actors or organizations that are making positive changes, because seeing that other people are acting is part of what gives us hope. The other thing that gives us hope is when we act ourselves. And when we act, rather than beating our head against a stone wall, like it sometimes seems like, if we think creatively, like I just highlighted, 500,000 elected officials in the US and 0.1% of them are federal. If we think creatively about where we can make a difference, from water to pollution to carbon emissions to climate resilience, so much of that action can happen at the local to regional level. And as our countries have grown over the last few decades, we've somehow become detached from the regional level. As media has become focused on the national level, we've forgotten what's going on in our city or our town. But reconnecting with real people in the places where we live and talking about what we could do together in those places, I think is a way that we can truly make a difference with each other. Because social science has showed that when we feel like we're all by ourselves and we can't make a difference, that's when we get despair and anxiety and we just feel like giving up. But when we recognize that we can make a difference and that by connecting with other people in our community, we can work together for change, that's where we get our encouragement, our hope, and that's where we actually can see change happening.
Well, I guess I just want to say thank you for your concern, and I appreciate that so much. And I'm so glad to be talking to two Canadians, actually. So that's actually wonderful. Before I get to the rough part, I'm actually going to do a little rough part against Justin Trudeau here. Before I get to that with the Keystone, let me just say my son actually plays hockey. Shout out to my son, River, plays college hockey up in Maine, which I know it's a big hockey thing is a big thing. Being from Louisiana, we don't have much ice in the swamp, so we know how much you Canadians love hockey. So that's one thing. Let's add that into the conversation right now. But I do want to just say this in regards to the hope and to accountability. One of the things that was disconcerting was that Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, called up President Biden to talk about the Keystone XL pipeline and how upset he was that he was going to be canceling that. And the one thing I'm shocked because on some days when I see his actions, I'm so encouraged. And I'm like, wow, that's an amazing climate. And then next day he does some things that I'm like, wow. And I just want to say to all those who are listening, you can't be a climate hero when you're talking about renewables on Monday, but you're talking about fossil fuels on Wednesday. That's just not how that works. And so I think that we have to understand to be a climate hero, it means you have to be a climate hero. You have to take a stand. And that's where my hope comes from. My hope comes there that I have seen so many people who have been rising up against all odds. And one thing I believe to the core of my being is that organized people beats organized money every single time. And I have been just so hopeful to see children rising up and poor people and Black and white and women and the infirmed, whoever, rising up to saying enough is enough. We must transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, and we must do it right now. And I've become so hopeful because of that, because they have changed the whole direction of this country and what that means. And so I'm hopeful for what that means. And I'm clear. If you could see, I would probably have one of my hats on that. I said, well, we'll say 9 years because we have so much time left with the IPCC report and many other things. But I'm hopeful that I actually believe that we can do it. I think humanity has got a fighting chance to make it happen, to do the good trouble, John Lewis would say. And I think that if we continue to do what we're doing, the odds are great. I'm not going to sit up here and sugarcoat it, but I actually believe that humanity has a chance to not only fight for equality, but to fight for existence.
So I want to talk a little about the new normal, ask you both. Last week in the New York Times, Royce Scranton wrote an op-ed saying that we can't go back to normal from where we've been in COVID. Going back to normal means more fires, more Category 5 hurricanes, more flooding, more drought, famine, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't mean to drag you down again, because actually, Katharine, your slides showed that during COVID, we went back a few millennia, it seems, in terms of carbon usage. I mean, we went back a long way, in a good sense.
Well,
but I'm wondering,
I would say about a decade and a half, but yes.
I mean, we Jews just think in millennia. I don't know. But what is sustainable? And I mean sustainable can we sustain of that? I know you said, people are getting back into the cars and doing the things that we stopped doing last April when things got so quiet. But I can drive from Stamford to Bridgeport in a half hour during rush hour still right now. Now, part of that is not for good reasons, but part of it is that I think people are changing their habits. So what is happening that can help us? And there were some questions in the chat about things that we could do individually, like stop eating cheese or whatever. What are some of the things that are happening because of COVID, because of this slowdown that could be sustained?
Absolutely. I feel in many ways, the pandemic has accelerated us about 10 years into the future in terms of being able to use technology to connect with each other like we're doing right now. This is essentially, it's low carbon, essentially zero carbon. You're powered by solar panels, I'm powered by solar panels. And we're also looking at different ways of just even living, different ways of eating, different ways of communicating, and not necessarily traveling as much either. So some changes are sustainable, but when we look at what's needed, we need a lot more. And here's what that looks like. First of all, one study estimated that the United States could cut its carbon emissions in half through efficiency alone. We waste over 60% of the energy we produce is wasted. Not only that, but about 40% of the food we produce is wasted. And when it decays, it produces heat trapping gases too. So just through reducing waste alone, we could get more than halfway there, which is incredible because more electricity, more food means less scarcity for people. Then we have to transition to clean sources of energy. We've been using fossil fuels for hundreds of years. They have served us well. They have brought us many benefits, and I'm grateful for them. But just like we no longer use horses and buggies, in the same way, it's time to move on from coal and even oil and gas to new ways of getting our energy. And during the pandemic, like I said, we accelerated that transition. 6 years ago, half of the new energy being installed around the world was clean energy. Now 90% is new energy. So that transition is happening faster too. But then we also have to figure out how to replace other sources of energy that aren't quite as easy as electricity, liquid sources of energy, high temperature sources of energy in industry. And there's a lot of really smart people working on that. Finally, again, we need policy mechanisms in place that send the right market signal because our fossil fuels are massively subsidized to the tune of something like $160,000 a second. So we need policies in place that actually encourage people and support people to make choices that are good for them, that are good for their children, that are good for the quality of our air and our water in our communities, and that are good for our future, because every action does matter. And we can take actions ourselves to reduce our carbon footprint, but if you do, don't forget to do the most important thing, which is tell other people about it. Because imagine if you decide that you're going to cut your food waste and then you tell other people about it, they start doing it too. It's actually contagious in a good way. Don't we all want to be that?
That's great. Rev, what do you think? Have some things started to change because of these shutdowns, because of COVID, that maybe can become good habits, or things that we can start to develop that can give us a head start in improving the world?
Yes, they have. We've definitely seen new ways, as Katharine put it quite well. We've seen us using technology. We've seen us becoming more mindful of using things that can actually help us to just be good for our planet. On the other hand, I think that we've also seen that when we are confronted by a crisis, the most vulnerable in our communities are at risk. And the same way they are with the climate crisis, that they are with the pandemic. And we've seen that with those who have been dying. Thank you for leading this conversation by centering it in our indigenous sisters and brothers. But they are being decimated in the Navajo Nation and throughout this country because of the same concerns of poverty and lack of health care, and lack of clean air and lack of clean water. We're seeing that within Black and Brown communities who are being decimated because of COVID and in alarming numbers. And so that's the one thing that we are still seeing, is that a crisis has a disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities. And I think that's what we need to really address in our conversation. So on the one hand, while we've seen some gains and we've seen how we can make some changes and we've seen some rollbacks, on the other hand, we've seen again that the front line and front fence communities are the ones who are most vulnerable. And I just want to say that that elections have consequences. One of the things in the past administration, they rolled back over 100 regulations in EPA protecting clean air and clean water and mercury rules and car standards. And a lot of those things exasperated the issues, even did not deal with the issue of clean water in Flint. And when people deal with poverty, they literally were shutting off people's water. The main thing to wash your hands. They were shutting off people's water in Flint, of all places. And people couldn't wash their hands during a pandemic. This is just morally wrong. So I think that on one hand, we saw some things that we can learn from, but again, we see now why we must do everything to combat not only the COVID crisis, but the climate crisis, because it definitely impacts our most vulnerable communities.
I just want to follow up with you something I asked Katharine before about religious go-to stories or homilies or theological approaches. I think it would be good to hear your approach. How do you approach this from a religious standpoint? Someone asked in the chat about creation care, for instance.
Well, I was blessed to be an Air Force chaplain. So I was blessed in that regard to serve my country. And, it's very unique to be in a military and be a person of faith and be actually the one leading on that. And so I kind of think of it the same way. And so for me, sometimes it's very unique to be in these conversations in movements and be a person of faith, because faith is such a unique thing to each person. But for me, the one thing that I have, and I work with a lot of young people, and one of the things that's been kind of we've been dealing with is the fact we've had a lot of young people who have been having conversations about not wanting to have children, bring children into this world. We've had a lot of young activists who have committed suicide because they feel isolated, not only from the pandemic, but that's because of the pressures of what is on them. And so, but I've been trying to bring faith. So what I bring into that conversation is really more so the standpoint of a faith, from the standpoint that you can't pull on yourself and do this work. You can't do this work, period, if you're jaded or bitter or cynical. But you can't do this work, and this is for like people who maybe have different faith traditions, but you can't do this work as an activist, as someone in this work, and not have anything to pull on, because then you'll pull on yourself and you can't stand. And so my faith approach to this is to tell people to have some kind of tree. For me, it's the tree planted by that river that is strong, but you got to have something that you got to have to pull on to do this work and to have faith. And wherever if you're Jewish or you're Christian or you're Muslim, that faith is what actually will help you to sustain you to overcome, because there will be a lot of things that you won't understand. And the one thing, and I'm obviously from the South, the one thing they'll say from down South is that the battle is not yours, but the Lord's. And you have to be in a position where a lot of times this work kind of propels people to be about themselves or do the work. And you got to know that this is a relay race. I mentioned earlier, from Rosa Parks to us to the next generation after we're long gone. We have to continue to pass on that baton and know that there is a higher power that is literally running with us in this process.
Terry?
I feel like I've been to church.
Yes.
Thursday night. But Rev, I have a question for you, and this actually ties in really what you were saying is
Wait, that's not allowed. I answer a question? Okay, it's fine.
No, this is for Rev. Sorry, but
Oh, Rev. I thought you said Rabbi.
anyone could jump in, because it's actually for religious leaders. Are religious leaders speaking enough about this in their congregations, taking care of the natural world, justice, climate change? And if not, Catherine's already saying no, they surely are not. How do we push them? How do we get them to start talking about it? Because people listen to their religious leaders, So Rev, why don't you start, and then Katharine and Josh, if you, please.
Yeah, it's okay.
Well, I would say yes and no. I mean, there are some obviously who are doing some amazing work within our sector. I guess if I'm looking at the screen here, I kind of see a lot of furry little blurry blots, but I'm assuming the one the one with the nice smile is Dr. Hayhoe. So she's one who's actually doing, and wave. Yeah, I can see the wave, and she's connecting the dots. So there are some amazing people in our faith traditions who are connecting the dots. To the question, I think what you're getting to is that there is a whole sector now, which we saw, particularly in this past administration, that has been dumbing down the faith process. And it's very concerning. And I've seen that. And they're attacking the science. They're attacking different aspects of this basic, the basics of what makes sense to anybody, really. But they're just attacking it in a way that is completely just, I'm just blown away. And they're preaching about it. I mean, they're literally going into churches and they're preaching. So I think to your point is that, are there people in our churches, in our faith traditions, who are doing the work? I agree. I would say yes. There is a whole new segment that I think we do need to have a conversation with, particularly in our evangelical wing of our faith tradition, who I think is literally just spinning it very, very differently. And I do think that we need to have more conversations. I'll say this too for folks, because I know this is in a seminary context. I do think it is important that we begin to also have these conversations within our within our seminaries. You know, I went to seminary and I loved, that discourse and that aspect. But I do think that this is very serious to begin to now return to have I know that we have the public square and faith conversation in our seminaries, but I think we need to have another conversation about that there's a thin line between faith and foolishness. And I think that we're seeing that thin line is going more to the foolishness side than on the faith side. So it is difficult, because I think on the one side, again, we're seeing some good work, the traditions that we've seen, but on one side, it is just jaw-dropping of what is happening and how people are just to me, just changing the gospel or the Quran or the Talmud or whatever. I am just blown away at how people are literally falling in line with Caesar in ways that I've never thought I would see in my lifetime.
Mm.
So we have time for one more question, maybe. By the way, I think that every community, every state, every location in this country has had some kind of existential environmental event over the last several years. For us in southwestern Connecticut, I think it was Hurricane Sandy, which was our come to Jesus moment, so to speak, where we began to take this much more seriously, and that's why this field behind me exists. But I don't want us to have to count on those to make changes. So I'm going to ask both of you, is it too late? Are you just humoring us? I mean, honestly, we've been warned for a long time. Al Gore is getting on in years, and it seems like it was too late a long time ago. Is it really too late?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I can tell you for sure the answer is yes and no. It is as if we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for years and even decades. So there is already some lung damage. There are already some spots on our lungs. The capacity of our lungs is already impaired. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So when's the time to stop? Now. If not now, as soon as possible. Because as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, so that's that group of scientists around the world who gathered together to produce those big assessment reports, every action counts. Every ton of carbon counts. Everything we do counts. Every degree counts. Everything that we do to reduce and minimize the impacts of climate change really does make a difference. Because like I said, we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So some of the impacts are here today. We already see stronger hurricanes, more intense rainfall events, flooding coastlines, more dangerous heat heat in the summer, bigger wildfires. Those are already here today. So we have to prepare for the impacts we can no longer avoid. But I study the future, and I know that there's all the difference in the world between a future where we reduce our emissions as soon as possible versus a future where we let them continue to grow. And what is at stake here is not the planet. The planet will survive. It's not even every living thing on this planet. Living things will survive. What is at stake here is human civilization as we know it. As John Holdren, who was President Obama's science advisor, said, he said, we have three choices. We can cut our carbon emissions, we can adapt or build resilience to the impacts we can't avoid, or we can suffer. And he went on to say, we will do some of each. The only question is how much, because the more and the faster we cut our carbon emissions, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be.
Rev, the last word.
Well, I think this is where the faith principle comes in. And I think that this is where we do things that don't make sense. As Dr. Hayhoe just said, and for me, reviewing the science, it will be a very tough road on some cases. But on the other hand, and this is where I guess if I was doing a little bit of my preaching in this aspect, I would point to, I would say, but there's a witness in the land, and there's a witness where this Constitution in this land didn't include women, but last year marked the time when 100 years women could vote. There's a witness in the land when there's folks who could not marry who they wanted to marry, and they literally were persecuted. And now we have a beautiful situation where you can love who you want to love. And there's a witness in the land where 401 years ago, people of a certain hue came to these shores as slaves. And not only did they become president, but then a woman who was also ostracized, who's also Indian, who's also Black, became vice president. And there are these funny, crazy things that happen that we do over time. And I would just say to us that with our faith, this is actually where faith comes full circle into this conversation. The odds are again stacked against us. But again, I believe where people come together, we can overcome. And I know the road may be tough, but again, organized people beats organized money every single time. And in conclusion, all power to the people.
Terry.
Well, that was amazing. What a great way to finish. I want to thank the Hartford Seminary for co-sponsoring this with us. It was such a pleasure. Rabbi Josh, you're always so wonderful to work with. And thank you so much to Dr. Hayhoe and Reverend Yearwood. What a great night. I am so inspired and uplifted. I hope everyone else is too. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first in what will hopefully be many offerings. We have another one on Thursday, April 8th, Religious Communities in the Planet and the Planetary Crisis, which we will be delving into this even more from different faith perspectives. And then if you're in Connecticut, we have a webinar coming up on Connecticut state legislation. And so to Katharine and Rev's point, there's a lot we could do locally, and this will be on Connecticut state legislation. We'll be talking about the environmental justice law, green justice zones, banning PFAS chemicals, and reducing plastic pollution. So that will be Thursday, March 4th. But anyway, again, thank you so much. Everyone have a terrific night.